Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Bryan. We're going to continue on with this week's theme of gateway songs, tracks that introduce you to a brand new sound of music and expand your horizons. Today we have one from Jordan, Dave Brubeck's Take 5. They state, I just did not get jazz when I was younger. The genre as a whole just refused to click with me when I was growing up. I found it boring, almost like it was lacking energy. Being admittedly forced to listen to this as part of a middle school music class gave me a whole new appreciation for the genre, and I still go back to listen on occasion. So that's what we're going to check out today. Um, we'll get into some context on this later. It's kind of interesting this was chosen for gateway songs. But for now, let's just dive into the music and see what Dave Brubeck is bringing to the channel today. I should state I've heard this many times, so not a first time reaction for me. Notice the bass emphasis on 451. Very light snare usage. Yeah, moving away from the more atmospheric sounds to a rhythmic one. The dynamic control is immaculate. Yeah, the use of phrasing here is done really well. Just slip right back into that pocket. It's been a while since I've heard that, at least that particular rendition of it. But yeah, I mean it still hits well. So a little bit of background on this. We've actually checked out another song from this album, Blue Rondo, a la Turk. We've listened to that before, I believe. Um, and that one was in 9. And of course, by the title here of Take 5, we're looking at a song that's time signature is 5/4. This whole album was actually, I forgot what the album's called. Uh, anyways, the purpose of the whole album, though, was to create a bunch of music with different time signatures on it. Stuff outside of the standard 4/4 that we would hear so much of, especially at the time. Uh, this wasn't it. No, that's not it. Time Out? Is that what it was? That sounds familiar. Yes. Yep. So Blue Rondo a la Turk actually started this off on the A side, and Take 5 ended the A side. Um, Jazz was sort of this exploration, music for musicians, so to speak. Um, and it became commercialized. And it's where, not in its entirety, but we began to explore swing and big band, which are very popular with non musician crowds. It took on this mass appeal, and in that mass appeal, it got simplified down a little bit. And I've talked about this in the past. It's what led to the creation of bebop, which was exceptionally abrasive jazz music, at least in relation to what was exceptionally palatable at the time. But one thing that I didn't really bring up in the last time that we've got on the topic of bebop and commercial jazz was Brubeck and his album Time Out. Um, some of this, I don't know how accurate it is. It's a little bit of what I remember from learning about the album all these years ago. So I probably should have looked this up a little bit, but I'm like 90% sure most of what I'm about to say is correct, anyways. Um, he had just got done traveling somewhere around the world. I don't remember where it was. And he just heard a lot of music and interesting time signatures. And he came back home, and he's like, jazz used to be exploratory. What happened to that? You know? So I want to do that again. And so he made an entire album of music that was odd time signatures, all of them. And this was the five on the album. And there was a bit of pushback, if I recall correctly, where his record label was like, "Nah, dude, this isn't gonna sell. You need to do something else entirely." But I think this might be a rumor, hearsay. I don't know if there's truth to this, but I remember him kind of doing this in secret and telling the record label after he had like written all this music. So it was sort of like, "Yeah, the ball's already rolling, man. There's nothing I can do about it." Um, Real sly cat. But anyways, yeah, he wanted jazz to be more adventurous, and we get stuff like Take Five. And what's bizarre about it, though, I mean, we can even see it right here on Rate Your Music, which I just pulled up to figure out the album title here. This album, Time Out, is number five for 1959, and part of that is retroactive. Like, Rate Your Music wasn't around in the late 50s because they didn't have the internet. But this track, this single, in fact, Take Five, ended up being immensely popular. I don't remember how popular it was, but it did get up on like the top 40s or whatever they would have called it at the time. I mean, nowadays, it's a top 40 countdown. I don't know what they used to call it back in the 50s though. Um, but yeah, it was topping charts. People loved this track. And, it just goes to show that giving people what they want isn't always the right move. It's usually a correct move, but it's not always the right one. And you can certainly achieve success with something a bit more esoteric or something that isn't as proven to be something that's going to work well from a business angle. But sometimes you just land on greatness and it clicks. And, to this day, I honestly don't know why it clicked. I don't know what it is about Take Five that just resonated with people at the end of the 50s, but they loved it, and I'm glad they did because I think it's a great track. So a little bit of the history lesson over. Let's talk about the track itself. Here's the interesting thing about it. It is the AABA jazz structure. We have the opening lick. We have the lick that comes after that. We go back to our first lick. We don't ever come back to the second. So in this little idea, We have sort of an ABA idea right here in our verse, but we sort of package that all up into the main idea. We do that twice, except the second time around, we just don't do the second part. And then we go into our B section, which is the solo section. And this takes up, well, out of the 7-ish minutes of this track, 5.5 are solo or something like that. What I'm wanting to point out here is that our A section is ridiculously short. It is 2 ideas. One of them is repeated, and it still only takes up like 40 seconds. And then we do revisit this towards the end of the track. The A feels functional. It is the lick that you're going to remember, right? I mean, that's the whole point of having an A. It's to give it a sense of stability so that it's not just a jam session. Because if, you can certainly do jazz just with improvised solos. It's a jam session. You got to have that pre-composed section, I think, to really turn it into a song. And here it feels like it is the most minimal amount of work necessary to turn this from a jam into a song. Our A section is just so short, but the thing is that it's catchy. And this was so popular that this has been used all throughout media, TV shows, film commercials, radio commercials, even. Just if you've existed for some time, you've probably heard this track somewhere. That lick, the A section itself, ba-doo, 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 boo, boo, boo. You've probably heard that somewhere in your life. And the thing is, you might have only heard it once. Some random little lick in the background of a single scene of a TV show you watched. And you listen to this reaction right here, and you're like, hey, I've heard that song somewhere. It is infectious. It's an earworm. It stays with you. There is something about it that is sticky. You hear it and you just can't get rid of it. It is a little thing that's going to sit in your memory for the rest of your life. And at one point in time, you're going to learn its name is Take 5, and you might not ever remember that. Every time you hear the song, you're like, hey, that's familiar. What is it, though? But it's just such a good verse. And I think it's really interesting to, I mentioned that it's functional. I mentioned that it's the bare minimal work to turn this from a jam into a song. But I think there's a positive way to read this as well, is that whoever wrote it, Dave was the composer. I think I feel confident in attributing it to Dave, but I'm not 100% sure if, when it comes to jazz songs, who knows who wrote it? I mean, I could probably go look it up, but what I'm saying is that, you have a group of musicians, like for here, the Brubeck Quartet. It doesn't necessarily mean that one person wrote every song. Ideas kind of flow from everyone. Kind of like with, any metal band too. You usually have your core composer, your person who writes most of the music, but that doesn't mean that your bassist doesn't get to write a song. So like, I don't want to say specifically that it was Dave on the off chance it wasn't, but whoever composed that lick, it almost feels like they innately knew, hey, this is good enough. It's not a lot. It really isn't a lot of music, but I can't get it out of my head. I love playing it. I love the way it sounds. I think people are going to have that reaction too. And then just leaving it at that, having the maturity to say, you know what? 16 bars and a repetition of our first 8 is going to be fine. And just really realizing the effectiveness of the minimalism here. Yeah. I'm not even, see, the thing is, I don't even think it's that good of an A section. It really does feel like, to me, listening to this, we need something to play before we start soloing on the 5. But it is good. It is catchy. But it also sort of is functional in a lot of ways. I'm kind of torn on it. Honestly, I tend to like A sections that are a bit more fleshed out, but it works. So anyways, the A section is minimal. The massive chunk of this is our B section, and I love the diversity in our solos. The saxophonist comes in, and it's a lot of little ideas, very typical jazz solos. Um, these little spurts of expressions, and they sort of exist on their own. It's like, oh, I have this neat little idea. All right, I got it out of me. What should I play next? And it doesn't necessarily need to be linked up to anything else. It's sort of very much actually not sort of stream of consciousness playing. You're not really trying to build the most diverse, complex, intertwined melody. It's just, hey, I'm playing in five. I might not even be comfortable playing in five. What ideas do I got coming out of my brain, out of my mouth, out of my fingers, and then just kind of throwing it out there into the ether. I'm not going to say that the saxophone solo really sticks with me in any capacity. I like what it explores, but as y'all have probably guessed, I'm a fan of cohesion. I love when things are massive and interlinked. Um, and while I do think that the solo does share something interesting on the larger concept of it, moment to moment, it really feels like it's filling space. Um, but what I love is how it acts as a counter. And I think that it does a fantastic job at creating the stream of consciousness concept because directly after that we get Brubeck's solo. And this is highly exploratory of an atmosphere. And I love it. The left hand sits on chords and just vamps out quarter notes, really laying down the pulse of the song, giving us that steady five. While the right hand is exploring these complex emotions. The chordal mode of the song sort of shifts from something jazzier and brighter and bouncier into something a bit more serene, and I'd even say borderline classical in some areas. It's a really interesting juxtaposition, not just to what the overall song feels like, especially coming from our rhythm section, but a massive juxtaposition to how the saxophonist explored this time signature and how they chose to craft their solo as a series of ideas, barely interlinked to this, which is more of an exploration of a single feeling. Of course, that's only like the first 60% of it. The back end, we do explore more of a rhythmic idea, playing around with syncopation, especially pushing against the five. To put in a metal perspective for a lot of y'all, it almost feels like we shift away from something more adjacent to post rock or maybe even black metal in some ways into something closer to djent and a rhythmic prog metal. It's really interesting to feel this in the middle of the song, in the middle of the solo, shift these gears entirely. But it still is about exploring a single idea in a very large time, almost going towards the idea of minimalistic music from the perspective of what minimalistic music is. Not necessarily just having a little bit of sound like we saw with the saxophonist, but the concept of taking one idea and stretching it out and really getting into the nitty gritty of it. Minimalism in music tends to sound very maximal, but it's about exploring a very small idea or a small amount of time. Um, yeah, so like it's just a really great juxtaposition to the sax's solo, while also just being a really great concept on its own. Again, I'm really big on these larger topic solos. You have a goal in mind and you're exploring that goal and theme in its entirety. And from here, of course, we swing over to the drums. We get a nice drum solo. And as I mentioned in the reaction, I really enjoy the pacing and flow of this. You can feel how he understands where he wants to be by the end of it and how he builds into that. Not just completely linear, always building towards it, but with these peaks and valleys. He ramps up the intensity, he brings it down. He ramps up the speed that he's playing. Is he playing 16th notes? Right? Brings it back down to quarter notes or little pockets of ideas, throwing out a few notes and then engaging with a bit of silence. And he builds and he lowers and he builds and he lowers, and the builds keep getting higher and the lowers also get higher. Now our peak's this high, now our valley's this high, and the peaks just keep rising, the valleys keep rising. And so if you plot it out linearly, we do have growth, but it's not a static, constant growth. And yeah, it is a good drum solo. I feel odd talking about drum solos because it's not my bread and butter. I'm really big on melody, flow, harmonic ideas. And so drums, I can really only talk about flow and pacing. But there is a nice melodic quality to the drumming at parts too, when he utilizes his whole kit and uses the particular pitches of them to craft sort of rising and falling ideas. I mean, he only has so many pitches to play with. It's not like he can, well, he can tune his snare or toms on the fly, but it would not be a great experience. And it would sound really weird getting back into the groove at the end. So it's not, what's the word I want? It's feasible, but it's not something you typically want to do. So he has a limited, notes, limited style of, limited number of notes he can play with, but he still kind of works within it. Dooga 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 dooga. You can still kind of feel the rising and falling of pitches in some of his ideas, even though it's not traditionally understood as a pitched instrument. But of course, what I am a big fan of is the spacing and the pace that we hear at the beginning. By the end of it, it gets closer to a rock style drum solo, just lots of sound, hitting everything, being fast, showcasing your chops. But I really love the patience at the beginning of it. Playing a couple notes and maybe using some ghost notes, maybe using pure silence, playing a few other notes and rising and falling ideas, really listening to the dynamics. One hand might stick with rising and escalating volume, while the other one might hit a loud one and then come down to a soft one, and then a softer one, and then a mid one again, and then a loud one. And so you really have these neat phrasing ideas just through what's accented, how loud things are played. It tells a story if you can listen to it. I find listening to drum solos kind of 50-50. And this one's no different. Some parts of it, I'm like, yeah, this is really good. I love what's being told here. And other times, I'm like, it's just kind of noisy. And I think that's just me. I'm a huge fan of melodic drumming, and I think that's just because it's really easy for me to understand it. Um, and when it comes to other styles of drumming that are equally as valid as something more melodic. It's more of a hurdle for me since it's not the language I tend to speak when it comes to music. And we've had this conversation in the past too. Listening to people who traditionally play melodic instruments, make drum patterns. You ever listen to a drum machine programmed by a guitarist? It's not usually as good as if it was programmed by a drummer. And also, if you listen to melodies, guitar parts, vocal parts written by drummers, that's kind of 50-50 as well. They're just very different skill sets, and people can certainly be good at both of them. But, they are two different skill sets entirely. So I definitely fall more into the melodic side than a rhythmic side. So, yeah, those are my thoughts on this track. I mentioned earlier that I thought it was funny this was a gateway song because it was a gateway song for an entire generation of people. I meant to bring this in earlier when I was doing the history on it. But yeah, a lot of people listen to the 4/4 palatable mainstream jazz stuff. And this was a doorway into more complex versions of jazz. So I think it's really interesting that this was also a gateway for somebody, presumably, years later. I don't know how old the requester was on it, but it got them. Well, they were in middle school when they heard it, so yeah, I'm gonna guess, later generation, it's still opening doors to jazz for people. I think that's awesome. Those are my thoughts on Dave Brubeck's Take 5. Let me know yours, though, down in the comment section. Give me your thoughts, opinions, perspectives, whatever you want to add to the conversation. Above that, in the description box, you'll find a link to Linktree. Takes you to this menu. You can find links to my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all 3 of those. Alright, we do have a special selection coming up next. Otherwise, I'll see you all tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 9 p.m. UTC. We're going to continue on with this week's theme. Until next time, remember to be critical and not cynical of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening whenever you choose to watch my videos.